In the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to ancient mountains like secrets to graves, there exists a family tree that doesn't branch. Instead, it spirals inward, twisting back on itself in ways that nature never intended. For 7 generations, the same surnames appear over and over again, married to each other, bearing children who carried the weight of their ancestors' choices in their very blood. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It isn't legend. It's documented history that most would prefer to forget, a genealogical nightmare that spans 2 centuries and reveals what happens when isolation, tradition, and desperation collide in the shadows of Appalachia. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with what time you're watching and where you're from. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The year was 1820, and the mountains of eastern Kentucky were a world unto themselves. Here, in the maze of ridges and valleys that seemed to exist outside of time, families didn't just settle. They became trapped by geography, poverty, and a fierce independence that would prove both their curse and their strength. Among these early settlers were the Colts, a family whose name would become synonymous with one of the most disturbing genetic experiments in American history, though they never intended it as such. Samuel Colt arrived in these mountains with his wife Martha, seeking the promise of cheap land and freedom from the judgments of civilization. What they found was isolation so complete that the outside world might as well have ceased to exist. Their nearest neighbors were hours away on horseback, accessible only by treacherous mountain paths that became impossible in winter. In this cocoon of solitude, the Colts began to build their dynasty, unaware that they were laying the foundation for generations of genetic horror. Samuel and Martha had 7 children, and as these children grew to adulthood in the 1840s and 1850s, they faced a dilemma that would define their family's fate. Marriage required partners, but partners were scarce in these remote mountains. The few neighboring families were either too distant, too hostile, or already interrelated through previous unions. So the Colt children began to look inward, to each other and to their cousins. It started innocently enough, second cousins marrying, a practice not uncommon in rural communities of the era. But what began as necessity would evolve into something far more sinister. The first documented case of close inbreeding in the Colt family occurred in 1855, when James Colt married his first cousin, Elizabeth Colt. Their union produced 6 children, all of whom displayed what local doctors at the time described as peculiar constitutions, a euphemism for the genetic abnormalities that were already beginning to manifest. But the family, isolated from medical knowledge and driven by tradition, saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. In fact, they saw it as keeping their bloodline pure, preserving their mountain heritage from outside contamination. They had no understanding of genetics, no knowledge of the terrible price their children would pay for their choices. The cycle of genetic degradation. By the 1870s, the second generation of Colts had come of age, and the pattern established by their parents had become not just accepted, but expected. What had once been born of necessity was now tradition, as sacred and unquestioned as Sunday service or the planting of crops by the moon. The children of James and Elizabeth Colt, themselves the product of first cousin marriage, now faced their own matrimonial futures, and with options limited to their immediate family circle, they continued the cycle with a determination that bordered on religious fervor. Thomas Colt, son of James and Elizabeth, married his sister Mary in 1878. Their union was celebrated by the family as keeping their mountain bloodline strong, but the children born of this marriage told a different story. Of their 8 offspring, 3 died in infancy from mysterious ailments that local physicians couldn't identify or treat. The surviving 5 children displayed increasingly severe physical and mental abnormalities, cleft palates, clubfoot, and what the family euphemistically called slow thinking. Yet, rather than questioning their matrimonial practices, the Colts doubled down, interpreting these challenges as tests of their faith and endurance. The isolation that had once protected the family from outside judgment now became a prison of ignorance. No doctors visited these remote hollows regularly. No government officials kept records of births or deaths. No social workers investigated the welfare of children. The Colts existed in a bubble of their own making, where their increasingly disturbing family structure went not just unnoticed but unchallenged. They developed their own explanations for their children's ailments: bad air from the mines, curses from neighboring families, the will of God testing their resolve. Sarah Colt, daughter of Thomas and Mary, married her uncle Benjamin in 1895, creating a genetic knot that pulled tighter with each generation. Their children, products of both sibling and uncle-niece inbreeding, began to display what can only be described as severe genetic breakdown. Mental disabilities became more pronounced, physical deformities more extreme. Several children were born with malformed or missing limbs. Others exhibited profound intellectual disabilities that rendered them completely dependent on family care throughout their lives. Yet the most chilling aspect wasn't the genetic damage itself. It was the family's adaptation to it. They created a hierarchy where the normal children cared for the severely disabled, where deformity was expected and abnormality was simply another mouth to feed. They developed their own crude forms of medical care, their own explanations for conditions that would have horrified trained physicians. The Colt family had become a closed system, feeding on itself, growing more distorted with each generation, while maintaining the illusion that this was simply their way of life. The documented horror. As the 20th century dawned, the third generation of Colts represented something that had never existed in documented American history: a family so genetically compromised that they had essentially become a separate subspecies, isolated not just by geography but by the accumulating damage of decades of inbreeding. The children born in the 1900s and 1910s were living testaments to what happens when the laws of genetics are systematically violated for nearly a century. Daniel Colt, born in 1902, married his own sister Ruth in 1920. By this point, the family's gene pool had become so restricted that finding any partner who wasn't a close relative was virtually impossible. Every eligible person in their isolated community was already related through multiple previous unions. Their wedding, held in the same mountain cabin where their grandparents had begun this genetic spiral, was attended by relatives who were simultaneously cousins, aunts, uncles, and siblings to both bride and groom. The children of Daniel and Ruth represented a new low in human genetic diversity. Of their 12 pregnancies, only 7 children survived to adulthood, and those who did displayed abnormalities so severe that they required constant care. 3 were born deaf and mute. 2 had severe intellectual disabilities that left them functioning at the level of toddlers well into their adult years. 1 child, Martha, was born with such severe physical deformities that she never learned to walk and spent her entire life confined to a wooden crate that served as both bed and wheelchair. What makes this period particularly horrifying is the documentation that survived. A traveling missionary named Reverend Samuel McKinney visited the Colt settlement in 1925 and kept detailed records of what he witnessed. His journal, discovered decades later in a church archive, described scenes that read like something from a Gothic nightmare. He wrote of adults who communicated primarily through grunts and gestures, of children with faces so malformed that he initially mistook them for victims of some terrible accident, of a family structure so confused that siblings were raising children who were simultaneously their offspring, nieces, nephews, and grandchildren. McKinney's most disturbing observation was the family's complete normalization of these conditions. They showed no shame, no recognition that their situation was anything other than natural. When he suggested that perhaps marrying outside the family might improve their children's health, the eldest patriarch, now in his 70s, explained with genuine bewilderment that outsiders were different people who might weaken the blood. They had created their own reality where genetic catastrophe was simply the price of maintaining racial purity, where deformity was evidence of their family's unique heritage rather than a sign of its destruction. The Reverend fled the settlement after only 3 days, but not before documenting what may be the most comprehensive early account of extreme inbreeding in American history. His journals reveal a family that had moved beyond merely marrying cousins. They had created a closed genetic loop where the same damaged DNA was recycled endlessly, amplifying defects with each generation while eliminating any possibility of genetic rescue. A medical horror story. The 1930s brought the Great Depression to America, and with it, the first government programs that would eventually penetrate even the most remote corners of Appalachia. It was during this period that the Colt family's genetic nightmare finally caught the attention of the outside world, not through humanitarian concern, but through a medical survey conducted by the Works Progress Administration. What the researchers discovered would challenge everything the medical establishment thought it knew about the limits of human genetic degradation. Dr. Harold Whitman, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky, was part of a team surveying rural populations for hereditary diseases. When local officials mentioned strange rumors about a family living deep in the mountains where everyone looked the same, Whitman initially dismissed it as mountain folklore. But in the summer of 1936, he made the treacherous journey to the Colt settlement. And what he found there would haunt him for the rest of his career. His official report, buried in government archives for decades, reads like a medical horror story. The fourth generation of Colts, now adults in their 20s and 30s, represented genetic damage so severe that Whitman initially questioned whether they belonged to the same species as normal humans. He documented cases of microcephaly so extreme that adult heads were smaller than those of typical infants. He found individuals with extra fingers and toes, not the simple polydactyly occasionally seen in normal populations, but grotesque protrusions of bone and flesh that seemed to sprout randomly from hands and feet. Most disturbing were the facial deformities, features so distorted that family members were often unrecognizable as human from certain angles. Robert Colt, born in 1915, had married his own daughter Susan in 1934. Their children represented a genetic dead end, the product of so many generations of inbreeding that their DNA had essentially collapsed in on itself. Of their 6 children, 2 were born without eyes, their skulls smooth where eye sockets should have been. Another was born with what appeared to be a second partially formed torso growing from his chest. One child lived to age 12 despite being born with her internal organs reversed, a condition so rare that Dr. Whitman had never encountered it in his 20-year career. But the most chilling discovery wasn't the physical abnormalities. It was the family's adaptation to them. They had developed their own crude medical practices, their own explanations for conditions that defied medical understanding. Children born with severe intellectual disabilities were assigned specific roles in the family hierarchy, often used as sources of entertainment for the more functional members. Those with physical deformities were hidden away during daylight hours but brought out for family gatherings where their conditions were celebrated as evidence of their bloodline specialness. Dr. Whitman's report recommended immediate intervention, including forced sterilization and removal of children to state custody, but the remote location and the family's fierce resistance to outsiders meant that his recommendations were never implemented. The Colt family continued their genetic spiral, now 4 generations deep in a pit of hereditary damage that seemed to have no bottom. Whitman himself suffered a nervous breakdown 6 months after his visit and spent the rest of his career studying fruit flies, claiming he could never again work with human subjects. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Extinction written in DNA. By the 1940s and 1950s, the 5th generation of Colts had achieved something that should have been biologically impossible. They had survived despite carrying genetic damage so severe that most of their children should never have lived past infancy. Yet they endured, creating a living laboratory of human genetic extremes that operated in complete secrecy in the Kentucky mountains. Their survival was not a testament to human resilience, but to something far darker, a family's complete abandonment of natural selection in favor of genetic suicide. James Colt III, born in 1928, was the product of 5 generations of continuous inbreeding. His parents were Robert and his daughter Susan, making James simultaneously his own great-uncle and the son of a father-daughter union. By the time he reached adulthood in the late 1940s, James displayed the accumulated genetic damage of his lineage, severe intellectual disability, partial blindness, and a spinal curvature so extreme that he walked permanently bent at a 90-degree angle. In 1950, he married his sister Patricia, and their union would produce what may be the most genetically compromised children in recorded human history. Their first child, born in 1951, lived only 3 hours. The infant's skull had failed to close properly, leaving the brain exposed and malformed. Their second child, Mary, survived, but was born without a functioning digestive system. She lived for 2 years, sustained entirely by liquid nutrition administered through a tube that the family had fashioned from stolen medical supplies. The third child, Samuel, was born with a condition so rare that it had no medical name. His bones grew continuously throughout his life, creating grotesque protrusions that eventually made movement impossible. What makes this generation particularly horrifying is the detailed records kept by Patricia herself. Unlike her ancestors, she had learned to read and write, and she maintained a journal that documented every birth, every death, and every deformity with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recording livestock breeding. Her entries, discovered after her death, reveal a woman who had completely dissociated from the horror of her situation. She wrote about children born without limbs as casually as someone might note the weather, described the death of infants with the same emotional detachment as recording a grocery list. The family had by now developed elaborate rituals around their genetic failures. Children who died within the first year were buried in unmarked graves behind the family cabin, their deaths unreported to any authority. Those who survived with severe disabilities were assigned numbers rather than names, reducing them to inventory in the family's twisted system. The more functional family members began to see themselves as caretakers of a sacred bloodline, preserving something precious rather than perpetuating something monstrous. Most disturbing was their increasing isolation from reality itself. They had created their own language, their own customs, their own explanations for the world around them. They believed that their genetic conditions were evidence of their family's divine selection, that they were evolving into something higher than ordinary humans. They spoke of themselves as the chosen people of the mountain, destined to inherit the earth through their genetic purity. The delusion had become so complete that they genuinely believed their deformities were signs of superiority rather than evidence of genetic collapse. The 1960s and 1970s witnessed the sixth and seventh generations of colts, and by this point, the family had transcended the boundaries of medical possibility. They had become living proof that human genetics could be pushed far beyond what nature intended, creating beings that existed in a twilight zone between life and death, between human and something else entirely. These final generations represented not just the culmination of 7 generations of inbreeding, but the complete breakdown of the genetic code that defines our species. Timothy Colt, born in 1955, married his own mother, Patricia, in 1975. By this time, the family's understanding of relationships had become so distorted that the concept of incest had lost all meaning. They were simply breeding from whatever genetic material remained available. Their children, born in the late 1970s, represented genetic damage so severe that several were born with conditions that had never been documented in medical literature. The 7th generation, born in the 1980s and 1990s, marked the effective end of the Colt bloodline. These children, if they can be called children, were born with genetic defects so extreme that most died within days of birth. Those who survived did so in a state that challenged the very definition of human consciousness. They existed in a vegetative state, unable to speak, recognize faces, or perform basic functions without assistance. Sarah Colt IV, born in 1978, was perhaps the last functional member of the family line. She possessed enough mental capacity to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with her family but lacked the ability or resources to break the cycle. In a journal entry from 1995, she wrote, "The babies keep coming out wrong. They don't look like babies. They don't sound like babies. Sometimes I think we're being punished for something, but I don't know what." She died in 2001, childless, marking the effective end of the Colt family's genetic experiment. By the early 2000s, the surviving members of the family could no longer reproduce. The men had become sterile through genetic damage, and the women could not carry pregnancies to term. The few remaining family members, perhaps a dozen individuals scattered across the original settlement, existed in a state of biological limbo. Local authorities, who eventually discovered the settlement in 2003, described it as resembling a scene from a post-apocalyptic nightmare. The family members who remained were so physically and mentally compromised that they required immediate medical intervention just to survive. Most were transferred to long-term care facilities where they lived out their remaining years under assumed names, their true identities buried along with their family's dark secret. The lasting legacy. Today, the cult settlement stands empty, a collection of rotting cabins slowly being consumed by the Kentucky wilderness. But the legacy of what happened there continues to haunt geneticists, anthropologists, and medical researchers who study the case files that were finally declassified in 2010. The cult family represents the most extreme documented case of human inbreeding in recorded history, a 7-generation experiment in genetic degradation that pushed the boundaries of what the human genome could endure before complete collapse. The medical records, when they were finally compiled and analyzed, revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about human genetics. The cults had survived conditions that should have been immediately fatal, developed crude adaptations to genetic damage that defied medical understanding, and created a family structure so distorted that it resembled something from evolutionary biology rather than human sociology. Their case has become a cornerstone study in genetic research, referenced in medical schools and research institutions as an example of the absolute limits of human genetic tolerance. But perhaps most disturbing is what the cult family reveals about the human capacity for self-deception. For 7 generations, they maintained the belief that they were preserving something sacred, something pure, even as the evidence of their genetic destruction accumulated around them. They created elaborate mythologies to explain their condition, developed rituals to celebrate their deformities, and convinced themselves that their suffering was evidence of their divine selection rather than their genetic suicide. The last known survivor of the cult family, a woman identified only as patient C-47 in medical records, died in a Kentucky state care facility in 2019. She was the great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of the original Samuel and Martha Colt, carrying in her damaged DNA the accumulated genetic errors of 7 generations of inbreeding. Her death marked the official end of a bloodline that had persisted for nearly 2 centuries in complete isolation from the outside world. The mountain settlement has been sealed off by state authorities, declared a biological hazard site. Local legends speak of strange sounds echoing from the abandoned cabins, but the real horror of the cult family lies not in ghostly apparitions, but in the documented reality of what human beings can become when genetics, isolation, and delusion converge in the darkness of places the outside world chooses to forget. In the end, they achieved the opposite of what they sought, not genetic superiority, but genetic extinction written in the language of human suffering across 7 generations of darkness.